The grease-stained walls of Golden Lotus loomed over me, their grimy surface a reminder of 2 decades of slow decay. My parents sat across the table, their faces etched with lines of exhaustion. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, like a warning. "Your brother's acceptance to Northwestern Medical is a blessing," my mother said, tightening the knot on her faded apron. Her words carried the weight of finality. "But someone must take over the restaurant. You understand, Lena?" Lena. The name rolled off her tongue so casually, yet I could feel the weight of it like a chain. 20 years old, halfway through my business degree at the University of Illinois. And this was what my future boiled down to: taking over a dying Chinese restaurant in a suburban strip mall. "What about my scholarship?" I asked, trying to keep the frustration from my voice. "My degree?" My father sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "Business degree, running the restaurant, it's the same thing. Besides, Arjun needs our help. Medical school is expensive." Of course. Arjun, the golden child. My perfect older brother who could do no wrong. The one who'd always been destined for greatness, while I was left to pick up the crumbs. "We'll use your college fund for his tuition," my mother added, her eyes fixed on the cracked linoleum floor. "The restaurant will be your inheritance instead." My inheritance. The Golden Lotus was a relic of the past, barely clinging to life thanks to a handful of loyal regulars who had been coming since I was a child. The menu was a bland patchwork of dishes, watered down to appeal to American palates in the late 90s. Nothing about the place had changed in 20 years. Not the decor, not the food, not my parents' stubborn refusal to adapt. "When do you need me to start?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Tomorrow," my father replied without hesitation. "We'll teach you everything: suppliers, bookkeeping, the recipes." The recipes. I thought of the tattered notebook where my father kept his list of shortcuts and prepackaged mixes masquerading as tradition. Sweet and sour chicken so sugary it could rot teeth. Stir-fried noodles that had nothing of the depth or balance Grandma used to achieve. Grandma Asha. Her name brought an ache to my chest, and my hand instinctively reached for the silver bangle she had gifted me before her passing. She had been the heart of the family, the one who had taught me to cook when I was barely tall enough to see over the counter. Her dishes had soul, the kind of flavors that told stories. Before she died, she'd entrusted me with a small wooden box, lacquered and carved with intricate lotus flowers. Inside were her recipes, her true recipes, but I'd been too busy with school to open it. "You'll honor the family, Lena," she had whispered in Hindi, her voice trembling but firm. "Not by following, but by leading. You'll know when the time is right." Lena. My mother's voice dragged me back to the present. "Are you listening? This is important." "Yes, Ma. I understand." I closed my notebook and gathered my things, the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. "I'll withdraw from my classes tomorrow." That night, back in my childhood bedroom, I finally opened Grandma Asha's box. The scent of sandalwood wafted out, and with it came a flood of memories: her soft laughter, her hands deftly kneading dough, her voice humming old Bollywood songs. But what caught my eye wasn't the recipes. It was the false bottom beneath them. I pried it open with trembling hands, revealing a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with my grandmother's delicate handwriting in a mix of Hindi and English. My breath caught as I read. This wasn't just a collection of recipes. It was the story of the original Golden Lotus, the restaurant my grandparents had built in Delhi before partition forced them to flee. The journal detailed techniques, spice blends, and dishes so legendary that people had waited hours for a table. But more than that, it chronicled their rise, how they turned a single roadside stall into a culinary empire. The final pages held something even more astonishing: details of hidden assets, accounts, and investments that had somehow survived decades of upheaval. "The true legacy is not in following the old ways blindly," she had written on the final page in English. "It is in daring to create something new. For Lena, when she is ready to lead." The next morning, I withdrew from college as instructed. But as I watched my father demonstrate his uninspired cooking techniques, my mind was already racing. The bangle around my wrist felt warm, almost alive, as if it carried my grandmother's blessing. "You'll learn everything exactly as we do it," my father insisted, pouring another packet of powdered curry mix into the pot. "No changes." "Of course, Papa," I replied, forcing a smile. But in my pocket, I fingered the key I'd found tucked into Grandma's journal, a key to her safe deposit box. Let them think they had one. Let them believe they'd successfully confined me to their vision of mediocrity. They had no idea that in forcing me into the Golden Lotus, they had handed me the tools to transform it. The first changes I made were subtle. I started with the spices, replacing the prepackaged blends with fresh ingredients sourced from a local specialty supplier. The butter chicken, once drowning in cream and sugar, now had the tang and richness of true makhani sauce. The samosas, previously soggy and bland, were crisp, golden, and bursting with flavor. The customers noticed immediately. "There's something different about the dal today," Mrs. Sharma said one evening, pausing after her first bite. "It tastes like home." My father frowned. "Are you altering the recipes?" "Just tweaking them slightly," I said innocently, trying to make the ingredients stretch further. That caught his attention. Money was tight, especially after Arjun's first tuition installment. The customers seemed happy, my mother offered tentatively. "They'll get used to it," I replied, hiding my satisfaction as I watched Mrs. Sharma scrape her plate clean. While my parents busied themselves with teaching me their outdated systems, I was making moves behind the scenes. Using Grandma's journal, I reached out to suppliers she had written about, places that carried the rare spices and ingredients that were essential to her signature dishes. Yes, the costs were higher, but I offset them by cutting inefficiencies my parents had overlooked for years. Then came the day I opened Grandma's safe deposit box. "What do you mean, she had investments?" my father demanded when I laid the documents before him. "Your grandmother barely had enough to get by. She was planning," I explained, "saving for the restaurant's future." The amount wasn't enough to cover all of Arjun's medical school expenses, but it was enough to transform the Golden Lotus into something extraordinary. My parents wavered between excitement and suspicion, their confidence in me shaken by the sudden revelation. "We should send the money to your brother," my mother suggested. "He needs it more." "The trust explicitly states the funds are for the restaurant," I replied firmly. "We use it to rebuild or it goes to charity." Grandma made her wishes clear. For the first time, my parents were speechless. And for the first time, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years: control. Golden Lotus was no longer a burden. It was my stage, and I was just getting started. They couldn't argue with Grandma Asha's clear instructions, especially not when I showed them the profit and loss statements. The small changes I had implemented, fresh spices, better suppliers, streamlined operations, had already increased revenues by 15%. "Fine," my father relented, his voice clipped, "but no major changes without consulting us." "I wouldn't dream of it," I replied with a smile that betrayed nothing. I waited patiently for the right moment, when they finally took their first vacation in 20 years to visit Arjun at medical school. As soon as they were gone, I made my move. The contractors arrived that very evening. The old Golden Lotus was gutted, every trace of its outdated, dimly lit interior removed. I replaced the greasy yellow walls with deep emerald paint, accented by warm wooden panels and gold fixtures that mirrored the elegance of the old-world deli restaurants my grandmother had written about. A mural of lotus flowers, hand-painted by a local artist, became the centerpiece of the dining room, a nod to the restaurant's namesake. The kitchen was transformed as well. Gone were the clunky, inefficient appliances my parents had clung to for decades. In their place stood professional-grade equipment capable of bringing Grandma's recipes to life. The biggest change, however, was the menu. The Americanized dishes were gone, no more sweet and sour chicken or watered-down stir-fries. In their place was a curated selection of recipes straight from Grandma's journal. Each dish was rooted in authenticity, carefully refined to honor the traditions of our family's cuisine. Signature dishes like dal makhani, charred naan, and biryani bursting with whole spices took center stage. And then there was her piece de resistance, nali nahari, a slow-cooked lamb shank in a rich, spiced gravy. When my parents returned, they were stunned. "What have you done?" my mother gasped, clutching her handbag as she took in the sleek, elegant interior. "Invested in our future," I replied, handing her a plate. "Come taste what real food should be." The first bite of nali nahari brought tears to my mother's eyes. She turned to my father, her voice trembling. This tastes like my mother's cooking." Before my father could respond, the dinner rush began. Word of the changes had spread quickly, and the dining room filled with curious newcomers and regulars who couldn't wait to see what all the fuss was about. Among them were older patrons, some of whom had emigrated decades ago, and families eager for a taste of home. "Just like Delhi," one older man murmured, savoring a spoonful of butter chicken. "No one cooks like this anymore." That night, we sold out of everything. The transformation of Golden Lotus, now renamed Golden Dynasty, was nothing short of extraordinary. Within 6 months, we were the talk of the Chicago suburbs. Local food bloggers, magazine critics, and influencers all raved about the rebirth of the restaurant. A triumph of tradition, one review read, "An ode to authentic Indian cuisine." One evening my mother called me, her tone anxious. "Lena, the medical school says they need another payment for Arjun's tuition. We thought maybe, since the restaurant is doing so well." I sat in my office, surrounded by press clippings and framed photos of the newly opened second location. "The restaurant's profits are being reinvested," I replied evenly. "We're expanding." The silence on the other end was heavy. "But your brother can take out student loans," I interrupted. "The same way I would have, if you hadn't taken my college fund." A week later, Arjun showed up unannounced. He stood in the middle of the bustling restaurant, looking out of place in his preppy sweater and neatly combed hair. "You're being selfish," he declared as I plated an order of Grandma's saag paneer. "Mom and Dad sacrificed everything for us." "No," I replied, setting the dish on the counter for a server. "They sacrificed everything for you. Don't confuse the two." His face flushed. "I'm going to be a doctor. And I'm already running a successful business," I shot back. Funny how that worked out. Before he could respond, the evening's reservations began pouring in. Among the diners that night were food critics from New York and London, drawn to Golden Dynasty by whispers of a young chef reviving lost culinary traditions. I turned back to my work, leaving Arjun standing awkwardly by the door. That night, as I prepared one of Grandma's most complex dishes, a layered biryani that required 6 hours of preparation, I felt her presence in the kitchen. Her voice echoed in my mind, her hands guiding mine as I balanced the spices to perfection. The critics were ecstatic, their reviews hailing Golden Dynasty as a masterpiece of authentic cuisine. Our reputation spread far beyond Chicago, and soon, reservations were booked weeks in advance. Even my parents, initially skeptical, began to see the restaurant in a new light. "Your grandmother," my mother said one evening, her voice soft as she watched the packed dining room. "She would be proud of what you've done." "She always knew," I replied, touching the bangle on my wrist. "She trusted me to carry her legacy forward." A year later, Golden Dynasty had expanded to 3 locations. Each one stayed true to Grandma Asha's philosophy: honor tradition, but don't be afraid to innovate. The original restaurant became our flagship, a living testament to the power of authenticity and the courage to rebuild. Michael graduated medical school, finally understanding the sacrifices I had made to keep our family's dream alive. Our parents, once resistant to change, now worked alongside me, deferring to my judgment and proudly introducing themselves to customers as the founders of the original Golden Lotus. The jade bangle remains on my wrist, a constant reminder of the grandmother who believed in me when no one else did. Her journal sits on my desk, its pages worn and marked, its recipes now the heart of a thriving empire. My parents thought they were condemning me to a life of mediocrity when they asked me to take over the restaurant. Instead, they handed me the tools to build something extraordinary. Golden Dynasty is more than a restaurant, it's a revival, a celebration of heritage and resilience. And as I stand at the helm of this growing empire, I know one thing for certain: this is only the beginning.